Well, welcome everyone today to this special Danube Institute event. Very, very nice to see everybody here with us today, and of course a particular welcome to our three guests. And before I get on to my remarks, amongst the guests, a particular welcome to Antonio Mario Fantini. Great that you're with us, Antonio. And the book of Toby Young's Father, The Rise of Meritocracy. There are 6 copies of that available at the front desk if anyone would like to buy one of those. So just a few comments about our special guests here today. Toby Young is a distinguished British journalist, writer, playwright, and educational reformer. He's associate editor of both The Spectator and Quillette, and is the son of Michael Young, later Lord Young, who coined the term meritocracy, using it in a hostile way, as I understand it, in his 1958 satirical novel, The Rise of Meritocracy. Toby Young is the co-founder of the West London Free School and has been a teaching fellow at Harvard. He's the author of 4 books, including How to Lose Friends and Alienate People, which was made into a Hollywood film, and 3 plays, including Who's the Daddy, which was named Best New Comedy at the 2006 Theatregoers' Choice Awards. He was also an energetic participant in the Vote Leave campaign and recently wrote a fascinating article on Boris Johnson, based in part on their time at Oxford together. His terrific output at The Spectator has included raising issues recently, such as the fact that only 11% of university academics identify as conservatives, whereas 22% identify as Greens, and the big issue of whether making jokes about vegans will soon be designated as a hate crime. After Toby has made his remarks, Professor Eniko Bolobás will respond. Dr. Bolobás is Professor of Literature at Eötvös Loránd University, Budapest, and is also a member of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. She's written books on the poets Charles Olson and Emily Dickinson, 2 histories of American literature, and over 200 other scholarly works. A graduate of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, Dr. Bolobás worked for the Hungarian government in the years immediately after the great changes of 1989, as both Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy in Washington and as Director of Atlantic and Israeli Affairs at the Hungarian Foreign Ministry. During this period, she wrote political opinion pieces for the Washington Post and the International Herald Tribune. After Professor Bolobás's presentation, Professor Peter Ákos Bod will comment and lead discussion among our 3 speakers. Dr. Bod is a distinguished economist at Budapest's Corvinus University and has also taught in the US at Portland State University and worked as a UN Development Program advisor in Ghana. After the 1989 changes, he was elected as a member of Parliament representing the Hungarian Democratic Forum and joined the cabinet of Prime Minister József Antall as the Minister for Industry and Trade. The following year, he was elected governor of the Hungarian National Bank, followed by a stint as a member of the board of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London before returning to academic work in 1998. So, again, a warm welcome to our 3 distinguished speakers, and at this point I'll invite Toby Young to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. This is only my 2nd visit to Budapest. My last was in '95 when I came to go duck hunting. But I did, when I was a student at Oxford, start a magazine called The Danube, which lasted 1 issue. So my father's book, full title, The Rise of the Meritocracy, 1870 to 2033, an essay on education and equality, purports to be a paper written by a sociologist in 2034 about the transformation of Britain from a feudal society in which people's social position and level of income were largely determined by the socioeconomic status of their parents, into a kind of utopia in which status is based solely on merit. And he invented the word meritocracy to describe this principle for allocating wealth and prestige, as well as the new society that this principle gave rise to. The essay begins with the introduction of open examinations for entry into Her Majesty's civil service in the 1870s that were inspired by the Northcote Trevelyan Report of 1854, hailed as the beginning of the modern era by the sociologist narrator. And the book continues to discuss real events up until the late 1950s, when it was actually published, at which point it veers off into fantasy, describing the emergence of a fully fledged meritocracy in Britain in the second half of the 20th century, and eventually the overthrow of that society in a violent revolution in 2034, 15 years from now. In spite of being semi-fictional, the book is clearly intended to be prophetic, or rather a warning. Like George Orwell's 1984, The Rise of the Meritocracy is a dystopian satire that identifies various aspects of the contemporary world, Britain in the 1950s, and describes a future that they might lead to if left unchallenged. Michael was particularly concerned about the introduction of the 11 plus by Britain's wartime coalition government in 1944, an intelligence test that was used to determine which children should go to grammar school, the top 15%, and which to secondary moderns and technical schools, the remaining 85%. And in the short term, the book achieved its political aim. It was widely read by Michael's colleagues in the Labour Party, and he ran the party's research department from 1945 to 1951, and helped persuade his friend Anthony Crossland, a left-wing intellectual who became Labour's education secretary in 1965 under the Wilson government, that the 11 plus, the intelligence test that all children took at the age of 11, should be phased out, and the different types of schools created by the 1944 Education Act should be replaced by non-selective, one-size-fits-all comprehensive schools. And Anthony Crossland, as Education Secretary, famously declared, quote, "If it's the last thing I do, I'm going to destroy every fucking grammar school in England and Wales and Northern Ireland." And he did a pretty good job. Today there are only 163 grammar schools left in England and 69 in Northern Ireland, and there are none in Wales. But even though my father's book helped to win the battle over selective education in the UK, and Theresa May's government made a brief attempt to bring back grammar schools, but the attempt ended in failure, so that battle has effectively still been won, he nonetheless lost the war. The term meritocracy has now entered the language, and while its meaning hasn't changed, it's still used to describe the organizing principle that Michael identified in the book. It's come to be seen as something good rather than something bad. My father's objection to meritocracy was rooted in his belief in equality. By equality, I don't mean what his friend Tony Crossland described as soft equality, equality of opportunity. Rather, I mean equality of outcome, hard equality. Indeed, it was partly because my father was an egalitarian socialist that he was so suspicious of equality of opportunity. If everyone is competing on a level playing field, that gives the appearance of fairness to the game's results, regardless of how unequally the medals are distributed. The problem with meritocracy, then, is that it helps to sustain the pyramid-like structure of modern Western societies. as a former communist who could never quite forget Marx's historical materialism, Michael looked forward to the day when socialism would replace capitalism and feared that the meritocratic principle, by helping to legitimize socioeconomic inequality, would delay that golden dawn. Unlike my father, I'm a classical liberal. I believe in the doctrine of inalienable natural rights as set out by John Locke in his second treatise of government, and think the legitimacy of the state derives from its being the best guarantor of those rights. My preferred metaphor is the state as a gardener, nurturing an environment in which people are able to pursue their own good in their own way, provided they don't attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to obtain it, to paraphrase J.S. Mill from the introductory to On Liberty. As soon as the state goes beyond that role and violates those rights in the name of some ultimate goal, it loses its legitimacy, which is to say, I believe in equal rights, equal treatment, and equal opportunities, and celebrate the victories of the Chartists, the suffragettes, civil rights activists, and others who've compelled the state to recognize those rights, but I don't believe in equality of outcome. And this is where I really part company with my father. As Hayek and others have pointed out, the difficulty with end-state equality is that the attempt to bring it about invariably involves the violation of our natural rights, and it rarely succeeds. In fact, never succeeds, might be more accurate. The standard Marxist justification for all the terrible crimes committed by communist dictators in the 20th century was that you couldn't make an omelette without breaking eggs, to which George Orwell replied, "Where's the omelette?" When I say that the attempt to bring about end-state equality inevitably means the violation of natural rights, I don't just mean that the creation of the socialist Shangri-La usually involves the confiscation of property by the state and the execution or imprisonment of the ruling class. Even after that initial levelling, it's unlikely that the state will just wither away, to use Engels's phrase, because natural abilities are distributed unequally. Behavioral scientists have taught us that it's just flat out wrong to think that varying levels of ability and success are solely determined by economic and historical forces. Rather, they're partly determined by genetic differences. And as Richard Herrnstein pointed out in IQ and the Meritocracy, if you equalize the environment, you exacerbate the impact of genetic differences. It's a dangerous fantasy to think that once you've eradicated socioeconomic inequality, human nature will flatten out accordingly, that you can return to year zero, as the Khmer Rouge put it. On the contrary, individual differences between human beings, rooted in biology, will stubbornly refuse to wither away, which means that an egalitarian society can only be maintained by a brutally coercive state that is constantly intervening to correct the iniquities of nature. This is a point well made by the libertarian economist Murray Rothbard in Egalitarianism as a Revolt Against Nature. Seen in this light, it's not surprising that nearly every hard-left socialist experiment has resulted in the suppression of free speech, the imprisonment and torture of political dissidents, economic stagnation, and of course, mass starvation, the main cause of the unnecessary deaths that occurred under communist regimes during the 20th century, estimated to be around 100 million. This point was actually nicely illustrated by a recent exchange on Twitter. Chris Hayes, the editor-at-large of The Nation, the leading left-wing weekly in the United States, tweeted, "The least sexy part of socialism is effective, efficient, bureaucratic administration, but the project lives or dies based on it." To which some wag replied, "I would say the least sexy part is breaking into the zoo and having to eat the animals." So I rather like meritocracy for the same reason my father was so suspicious of it, because it helps to legitimize the inequalities of outcome that are the inevitable consequence of keeping state power in check. I believe that type of inequality can be justified by appealing to natural rights alone, but the virtue of meritocracy is that it provides socio-economic inequality with an additional source of legitimacy. And I say that not as someone who's fond of outcome inequalities for their own sake, but as someone who believes them to be an unavoidable byproduct of limited government, characterized by the rule of law, the separation of powers, an elected legislature, an independent judiciary, free speech, and so on, and that any more extensive form of government will breach our natural rights. Socioeconomic inequality is a cost, not a benefit, of limited government, but it's a lower cost than those associated with the maximalist socialist state. So how does meritocracy help to secure people's consent to socioeconomic inequality? By A, allocating wealth and prestige according to merit, which on the face of it is fairer than the hereditary principle, and B, creating opportunities for those born with very little. So if you start with nothing, that doesn't mean you'll end up with nothing, or that your children will. If you think a free society in which our natural rights are protected is preferable to one in which they're at risk from an overbearing state, and social and economic inequality is one of the costs of reigning in state power, then you should embrace the meritocratic principle for helping to make limited government sustainable. But is meritocracy really capable of playing that legitimizing role? So let's consider those two mechanisms in turn. First, does meritocracy allocate wealth and prestige in a way that appears to be fair? The sociologist who narrates The Rise of the Meritocracy, a fictional character created by my father, defines merit as IQ plus effort. Is it fair to allocate socio-economic status, SES, according to merit? Not according to the philosopher John Rawls. In A Theory of Justice, he appealed to the fact that people don't deserve their natural gifts, and the consensus amongst intelligence researchers is that genetics plays a bigger role than the environment in creating differences in IQ, to argue that a meritocratic society wouldn't be any fairer than one in which your wealth and status is entirely determined by your initial starting place in society. Your genetic endowment is, according to Rawls, dependent on a natural lottery. The better endowed, from a genetic point of view, like those who are lucky in the social circumstances of their birth, have done nothing to deserve these advantages, any more than the winner of any other kind of lottery deserves their prize. So they don't deserve what flows from them, such as their elevated SES in a meritocracy. The implication of this is that, as a principle for allocating wealth and status, meritocracy is no fairer than the hereditary principle. On the contrary, it's just another manifestation of that principle, only instead of people inheriting privilege via tax-efficient trust funds, they inherit it via parental DNA. Which is not to say that all parents who enjoy natural gifts will pass them on to their children, only that all children born with natural gifts will have got those gifts from their parents' DNA. Rawls's argument isn't a decisive blow against meritocracy. It's too deterministic, for one thing. Wealth and prestige don't simply flow from a person's natural endowments. A considerable amount of hard work is also involved. Merit is IQ plus effort, remember. And rewarding that effort does seem fair. In response, it's worth pointing out that Rawls believed the superior character, those were his words, that enables some people to make the effort to cultivate their abilities, quote, depends in large part on fortunate family and social circumstances, unquote, and that's something they can claim no credit for. This is what Rawls calls the social lottery, and allowing it to dictate people's chances in the game of life is no fairer than relying on the natural lottery. Even if we reject this analysis and insist that there's a good deal of agency involved in the cultivation of one's genetic endowments, there's still what you might call a gearing difficulty. Because some people are blessed with more natural gifts than others, the same amount of effort by different people will reap different rewards depending on their genetic endowment. An effortocracy, in which wealth and status is entirely dictated by how hard people work, would look very different to a meritocracy. You can see how a hereditarian socialist, someone who doesn't base her egalitarian political ideals on the belief that all human beings have the same natural capacity, but believes nature plays a bigger role than nurture when it comes to influencing differences in behavior, personality, and intelligence, might make use of research findings in behavioral genetics to advance the case for redistributive taxation. If no one deserves their natural abilities, and there's a strong correlation between IQ and socioeconomic status, then the rich don't deserve to keep all their wealth. When people like me talk about meritocracy and genetics in the same breath, people often hear it as a social Darwinist defense of the status quo, but you could just as easily, more easily perhaps, appeal to the link between IQ and socioeconomic status to make an argument for redistribution. And indeed, at least one left-leaning behavioral geneticist has done precisely that. Incidentally, hereditarianism could also be invoked to challenge other conservative beliefs, such as the view that homosexuality or transgenderism is a choice, and that obesity, addiction, and various forms of mental illness are matters of personal responsibility. As the philosopher Alan Ryan put it, quote, "A belief in the importance of inherited differences need not lead to apocalyptic conservatism," unquote. However, there's another more fundamental problem with Rawls's argument. It mixes up desert with entitlement. A person may not deserve her wealth in a meritocratic society because it's at least partly contingent on factors that are, as Rawls puts it, arbitrary from a moral point of view. But that doesn't mean she's not entitled to her wealth, which depends on how she came by it. As Rawls's great Harvard sparring partner, the philosopher Robert Nozick, points out in Anarchy, State, and Utopia, so long as a person's acquisition of a holding has not involved violating anyone else's rights, she's entitled to keep it and bequeath it to her children, or indeed anyone else. Nozick calls this the entitlement theory. I said earlier that the unequal distribution of wealth and status that's the inevitable consequence of reigning in state power can be justified by appealing to natural rights alone, but the meritocratic principle confers additional legitimacy. However, it looks as though the first way it does this, by coating inequality with the appearance of fairness, only works if you invoke a Nozickian rights-based defense of inequality, which begs the question, why bother with the meritocratic defense at all? Why not just appeal directly to a Lockean conception of natural rights? It's also worth pointing out that Nozick himself isn't a fan of meritocracy. He regards it as just another patterned principle of distributive justice. That is, a principle that maintains that a distribution is only just if it conforms to a particular pattern. A meritocratic pattern may look fairer than a hereditary pattern, but trying to impose such a pattern on a society and maintaining it will inevitably involve violating people's rights. In Anarchy, State, and Utopia, Nozick quotes Hayek, who was also skeptical about the meritocratic principle, to underline this point. Quote, "Our objection is against all attempts to impress upon society a deliberately chosen pattern of distribution, whether it be in order of equality or of inequality," unquote. One final point before I move on to the second way in which meritocracy might contribute to a greater tolerance for inequality. In my father's book, he portrays meritocracy both as a sinister device for legitimizing economic inequality and at the same time as failing so badly in this purpose that it eventually leads to a violent revolution in which the cognitively disadvantaged overthrow the meritocratic elite. How can it do both? The answer is that the apparent fairness of meritocracy deprives the vast mass of ordinary people of the excuse that the reason they're not more successful is because they're unlucky. They don't know the right people, they weren't born with silver spoons in their mouths, etc. Because they accept the meritocratic order, because they regard the unequal distribution of wealth and status as legitimate, they're forced to conclude that they deserve their own failure. And that comes with a terrible psychological cost. It breeds resentment, not acceptance. So the reason meritocracy fails, according to my father, is not because it doesn't succeed in persuading people inequality is fair, but because it does. The same argument is made in the Meritocracy trap, the tyranny of just desserts, a blistering attack on meritocracy published earlier this month by Daniel Markovits, a professor at Yale Law School. And I've just reviewed this book for The Spectator. The review came out today. Markovits says that meritocracy in America confines the middle-class majority to the periphery of national life, quote, exiles it from the heart of economic and social life, and confines it to economic hinterlands and cultural backwaters, unquote, echoing the critique of the French geographer Christophe Guillet in Twilight of the Elites. Markovits continues, quote, by declaring its inequalities just, meritocracy adds a moral insult to the economic injury of middle-class stagnation. This insult carries enormous additional costs. One of these costs, Markovits believes, is the resurgence of right-wing populism and the election of Donald Trump. Meritocracy leaves vast swathes of the middle class feeling alienated and resentful, and the only way they can articulate these feelings is to embrace their own version of victimhood, borrowing the language of identity politics from the postmodern left. So they claim that whites, males, heterosexuals, and Christians are marginalized and oppressed. And when the elites try and shore up their meritocratic credentials by preaching the gospel of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and engage in various forms of positive discrimination to counter the historical legacy of white privilege, it exacerbates this sense of victimhood. In this light, it's misguided to regard meritocracy as making limited government more sustainable by legitimizing the inequalities that are its inevitable byproducts. On the contrary, by coating these inequalities with the appearance of fairness, it makes those inequalities less sustainable. What about the second way in which meritocracy helps to legitimize inequality? That in a meritocratic society, people born on the wrong side of the tracks will have more opportunities than they would in a class-bound society. If you measure opportunity by the number of people participating in higher education, that certainly seems to have happened since the publication of the Northcott-Trevelyan report, which my father identified as the start of the meritocratic era. In 1920, 5,060 students obtained university degrees in the UK. In 2017-18, that number had climbed to 777,005. With the Department for Education estimating that roughly half of all English 17 to 30-year-olds now participate in higher education. And we see a comparable increase in the United States. In 1894, there were only 63,000 students enrolled in higher education institutions in the US, representing just 1% of the population. Today, the number is approximately 20 million, 40% of all 18 to 24-year-olds. However, when it comes to intergenerational social mobility, Britain and America are not faring very well, in spite of this huge expansion in the higher education sector. In one recent league table, Britain, I think it was a league table measuring intergenerational social mobility in the OECD. In that league table, Britain was rock bottom, with America third from bottom. In a recently published book called Social Mobility and Its Enemies, Lee Elliott Major and Stephen Machin point out that there is a stickiness at either end of the income distribution curve in the UK. So those born in the bottom income quintile are likely to end up poor, and those born in the top quintile are likely to be rich. And those quintiles have become more sticky, not less, in the past 50 years. In the meritocracy trap, Daniel Markovits produces lots of data to show how dominated America's elite universities are by young people from rich households. Quote, at Harvard and Yale, more students come from households in the top 1% of the income distribution than from the entire bottom half, which is a pretty extraordinary, staggering statistic. The standard response of the meritocrat to points like these is that they show that Britain and America are not yet sufficiently meritocratic, and we need to take various steps to make them more so, such as spending more money on early childhood intervention programs. However, it doesn't follow from Britain and America's flatlining intergenerational social mobility that they're not mature meritocracies. In Blueprint, How DNA Makes Us Who We Are, the behavioral geneticist Robert Plomin argues that the heritability of socioeconomic status, that is, the correlation between differences in SES and genetic differences within a given population, is one way of measuring how meritocratic a society is. It's an imperfect measure, since it ignores the effort side of my father's equation. It downplays human agency and focuses on IQ and other heritable psychological traits that are linked to socioeconomic status. But nevertheless, it enables us to evaluate the impact of environmental differences, such as parental occupation, on different outcomes. And it turns out they're not as significant as most people think, at least not in the Western world. According to Plomin, the research evidence suggests that in contemporary Britain, socioeconomic status is highly heritable. School achievement, for instance, is about 60% heritable, while occupational status and income are about 40% heritable. You might think that still leaves quite a lot of room for nurture, but Plomin distinguishes between nurture and the environment more generally, and marshals evidence from behavioral and molecular genetics to show that in the UK and other Western countries, the most salient aspects of the environment when it comes to influencing things like educational attainment are unsystematic, random experiences, not the home you're brought up in or the school you attend, which is how Plomin defines nurture. What we think of as nurture has a negligible effect on how people turn out, says Plomin, which suggests Britain is well on its way to becoming a mature meritocracy in spite of low levels of social mobility. And that's also the view of the sociologist Peter Saunders. In Social Mobility Myths, he argues that in the UK, cognitive ability is more important than class origins in influencing class destinations, twice as important, to be exact. Quote, "To the extent that it's possible to predict someone's occupational destiny, it's their ability and their motivation that matters much more than the social class into which they're born." He bases this in part on an analysis of the famous longitudinal study of social mobility carried out by the sociologist John Goldthorpe and his colleagues at Nuffield College, which involved a nationally representative sample of 10,000 men. The strong correlation between the social classes of fathers and sons within this cohort doesn't mean Britain is unmeritocratic, according to Saunders. If you factor in the men's IQs, he says, the level of mobility is exactly what you'd expect it to be in a perfect meritocracy. Quote, "The social mobility histories of the 10,000 men interviewed for Goldthorpe's study in 1972 are almost precisely what we would have expected to find had they and their fathers been recruited to their class positions purely on the basis of their intelligence." So the fact that the rate of intergenerational social mobility in the UK and the US is low doesn't mean that they're not meritocracies. But if they are, why is social mobility flatlining? Could there be something about meritocratic societies that makes it harder, not easier, for people born into poverty to pull themselves up by their bootstraps? If so, that would certainly invalidate my second reason for supporting meritocracy. So how might that mechanism work? Let's imagine a society in the not too distant future that's a fully fledged meritocracy. In that society, the people at the top would also be the most able, and the people at the bottom the least able. And the reason you wouldn't have much movement between these two poles, the stickiness identified by Major and Machin, is because many of the psychological traits linked to socioeconomic status are genetically influenced, and children genetically resemble their parents. That is, the reason there isn't more intergenerational social mobility in this notional meritocratic utopia is because intelligence and other psychological traits linked to socioeconomic status are not randomly distributed across the population, but passed down from parents to their children via their DNA, with systematic environmental differences amounting to little more than noise, assuming Plomin is correct. Of course, some parents of above average intelligence will have children of below average intelligence, and vice versa, and reversion to the mean will ensure that, for the most part, the children of parents who are intellectual outliers will be closer to the norm. Nevertheless, in aggregate, Parents of above average intelligence will have children of above average intelligence, and the opposite is true of parents of below average intelligence. In this way, meritocratic societies have a tendency to ossify, to degenerate into genetically based caste systems. That's exactly what's begun to happen in America, according to The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life by Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray. Up until the mid-20th century, this tendency was kept in check, they argue, in part because of limited opportunities for gifted people born in the bottom half of society to rise, and in part because highly intelligent men and women, being rare and geographically dispersed, didn't often meet. However, a number of things changed over the course of the 20th century. Economic growth and technological progress created a rise in demand for educated workers, which in turn meant an explosion in the number of university places from the mid-1950s onwards. As more people entered higher education and standardized testing became more widespread, America's best universities became more selective, with the brighter students going on to even more selective graduate schools to prepare them for entry into the elite professions, thereby transforming the socioeconomic elite into a cognitive elite. At the same time, more women began to be admitted to college, and as a result, the opportunities for highly intelligent men and women to pair up and have children increased, a function not just of their being in close proximity to one another, but of assortative mating, a well-documented phenomenon whereby people tend to choose mates who are similar to themselves, both physically and mentally. And this tendency of the intellectually gifted to pair bond was exacerbated by what Herrnstein and Murray call cognitive partitioning, quote, the increasing segregation of the cognitive elite from the rest of society, unquote. The upshot is that American men and women with high IQs have become more likely to mate and produce children of significantly above average intelligence. Not quite as intelligent as them in aggregate, but bright enough to stand a better chance of getting high-paying jobs in the knowledge economy than the children of parents who aren't themselves members of the meritocratic elite. Regression to the mean still occurs, but according to Herrnstein and Murray, it's begun to happen more slowly as a result of this convergence of social and historical factors, slowly enough to create an ossification problem. And for related reasons, the same sorting mechanism is also at work on the left-hand side of the IQ distribution curve. Herrnstein and Murray cite plenty of data to show that this genetic stratification, as they call it, has begun to happen. For instance, they refer to the work of the sociologist Robert Mayer, who found that the odds of a college graduate marrying someone who wasn't a college graduate declined from 44% in 1940 to 33% in 1980. Are these parents producing children of above average intelligence? Yes, for the most part, says Murray. In Coming Apart, a kind of follow-up to the bell curve, published about 10 years later, he writes, the reason that upper middle class children dominate the population of elite schools is that the parents of the upper middle class now produce a disproportionate number of the smartest children. For example, one of the basics for having a decent chance of getting into an elite school is a high SAT score, with high defined as at least 700 on the SAT Verbal and SAT Math. Among college-bound seniors who took the SAT in 2010, 87% of the students with 700-plus scores in the math and verbal tests had at least one parent with a college degree. 56% of them had a parent with a graduate degree. Similar data is presented by Daniel Markovits in the Meritocracy trap, although he steers clear of attributing the differences in SAT results between rich and poor children to genetic differences. On the contrary, he attributes them entirely to the amount of time and money America's meritocratic overlords lavish on their children's education, estimating they spend around $10 million more on education per child than the average middle-class family. Quote, the income achievement gaps on the SAT are enormous, this is Markovits. Students from families earning over $200,000 a year, roughly the top 5%, score 388 points higher than students from families earning less than $20,000 a year, roughly the bottom 20%. And students whose parents hold graduate degrees, roughly the top 10%, score 395 points higher than students whose parents have not completed high school, roughly the bottom 15%. In each case, these gaps in raw scores placed the average elite student in roughly the top quarter of all test takers and the average disadvantaged student in the bottom quarter, unquote. This tendency for meritocracies to degenerate into even more rigidly stratified societies than the ones they've replaced, self-perpetuating cognitive oligarchies, is one of the causes of the collapse of the meritocratic society at the end of my father's book. At one point, the naive narrator enthuses about this biosocial trend, not realizing how corrosive it is. Quote, by 1990 or thereabouts, all adults with IQs of more than 125 belong to the meritocracy. A high proportion of the children with IQs over 125 were the children of those same adults. The top of today are breeding the top of tomorrow to a greater extent than at any time in the past. The elite is on the way to becoming hereditary. The principles of heredity and merit are coming together. This vital transformation, which has taken more than 2 centuries to accomplish, is almost complete. So that was the naive narrator of the rise of the meritocracy, supposedly writing a year before it all came tumbling down after a violent revolution, partly because of this phenomenon he's identified. But is that really happening in contemporary Britain and America? Are the top of today really breeding the top of tomorrow? Not according to Dalton Conley and Jason Fletcher, a sociologist and an economist, respectively. In The Genome Factor, What the Social Genomics Revolution Reveals About Ourselves, Our History and the Future, which was published 2 years ago, they look at whether assortative mating based on genetics increased in the US over the course of the 20th century, and they conclude that it hasn't. They point out that the bell curve's hypothesis relies on treating a certain level of educational attainment as a proxy for the possession of certain genetic characteristics. If assortative mating by phenotype, years in education say, increases, that must mean assortative mating by genotype has increased. But what if that assumption's wrong? Since the publication of the bell curve, a revolution in molecular genetics has taken place, and it's now possible to test Herrnstein and Murray's hypothesis using molecular genetic data, something Conley did in 2016 with Benjamin Domingue, an assistant professor of education. Quick sidebar, rapid progress has been made in the last few years in identifying the genetic markers linked with intelligence via genome-wide association studies known as GWAS. These studies, usually involving sample sizes of hundreds of thousands, aim to identify loci throughout the genome associated with an observed phenotypic trait, such as the number of years spent in full-time education. This is an exciting development, since until recently, behavioral scientists had to rely on family studies, twin studies, and adoption studies to demonstrate that differences in general cognitive ability are linked to genetic differences. Now they can point to actual genetic markers known as single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs, that explain more than 11% of the variance in IQ. That's more than is explained by parental education. And in the next few years, as the data sets get larger, we'll be able to predict as much as 30% of the variance in IQ based on these genetic markers alone. This makes it nigh on impossible for anyone to claim that differences in intelligence between individuals are all to do with nurture and nothing to do with nature. Conley and Fletcher don't dispute that assortative mating by phenotype increased during the 20th century. They note that the percentage of American men with college degrees who married women with college degrees increased from 32% in 1960 to 65% in 2000, although they point out that data like this is inconclusive because the increase could be explained by the higher number of female graduates in 2000 than in 1960. So even if men and women chose who to marry at random, the number of graduates getting married to each other would increase. But on the specific issue of whether genetic assortative mating has increased, they're confident that it has not. In his paper with Domingue, Conley looked at genetic data from the Health and Retirement Study, a longitudinal study of more than 20,000 Americans, and examined whether married couples from the cohorts born later in the 20th century were more similar in terms of the genetic markers associated with educational attainment, as identified in a 2013 GWAS with a sample size of 126,559, than couples from the cohort born earlier? The answer is no. In fact, they were slightly more dissimilar, which suggests genetic assortative mating didn't increase over the course of the 20th century. Conley and Domingue also found that a polygenic score based on this same set of genetic markers, a probabilistic score assigned to an individual based on how many of these markers she possesses, was also marginally less likely to predict years of education in the second half of the 20th century than it was in the first. In other words, the link between genetics and socioeconomic status has grown weaker rather than stronger since 1900. SES has become less heritable. That doesn't conclusively show that Herrnstein and Murray are wrong about the existence of a cognitive hereditary elite, but it suggests that the more conventional explanation for the current stagnant levels of intergenerational social mobility is correct, namely that America's elites are increasingly able to pass on their superior status to their children by leveraging their socioeconomic privileges, not because their children are more and more likely to be born with high polygenic scores for educational attainment. The solution, then, could be more meritocracy. Conley and Fletcher write, quote, "Though we are a mere decade and a half away from the 2034 date on which Young predicted the final revolt against an entrenched meritocratic system would occur, it seems, if the present results are to be believed, that we're still considerably removed from the dystopian nightmare he imagined more than half a century ago." However, before accepting this conclusion, that Britain and America are not becoming genotocracies, which is Conley's word for genetically based caste systems, it's worth pointing out that in the past 6 years, researchers have identified many more of the genetic markers associated with educational attainment. The SNPs linked to attainment in the 2013 study Conley and Domingue rely on only predicts 2 to 3% of the attainment variance. More recent studies, involving sample sizes of over 1 million, have identified over 1,000 independent genome-wide significant SNPs linked to attainment, and they predict between 11 and 13% of the variance. To find out whether America is more or less meritocratic than it was 100 years ago, we would need to rerun Conley and Domingue's test on the same data set, or apply a comparable test to a different data set using a more up-to-date, larger number of genetic markers. And a group of researchers at Edinburgh University are doing precisely that. It's worth noting that a similar piece of analysis, relying on more recent polygenic scores for educational attainment, was used to compare communist and post-communist Estonia. And the researchers concluded that the latter, post-communist Estonia, is more meritocratic than communist Estonia. That is to say, polygenic scores for educational attainment predict more of the variance in socioeconomic status in contemporary Estonia than they did during the Soviet era, twice as much, in fact. That may be because socioeconomic status in Soviet-era Estonia was more closely linked to membership of the Communist Party, or being related to a party member, than it was to IQ. And it would be interesting to conduct a similar comparison of pre-1989 Hungary with the Hungary of today. Like Conley and Fletcher, Robert Plomin is skeptical about Herrnstein and Murray's hypothesis. He gives 2 reasons for thinking there isn't much risk of a meritocracy degenerating into a genotocracy. First, because the environmental variables that influence socioeconomic status are, according to him, more or less random, and, quote, "random effects will not create stable castes," unquote. Second, because parents and their children are genetically similar but not identical. This means that in aggregate, the children of parents whose mean IQ is above average will have above average IQs and vice versa, but the dissimilarity means that the IQs of their children will vary quite a lot, with some of them below average, and some of the children of parents whose mean IQ is below average will have above average IQs. Therefore, there's still some scope for movement up and down the ladder, even in a mature meritocracy. Quote, "This reshuffling of DNA differences in the genetic lottery prevents the evolution of a rigid genetic caste system," unquote. Even though Conley and Fletcher think my father's pessimism about meritocracy was overstated, they caution against complacency. While Britain and America haven't yet degenerated into genotocracies, they may in time, thanks to the revolution in molecular genetics. People don't currently make use of genomic data when it comes to selecting mates, but they may when it becomes more widely available, and once genome-wide association studies have pinpointed more precisely the genetic markers associated with desirable phenotypic traits. As they put it, quote, "What if eHarmony and OkCupid merged with 23andMe, and a key feature of your profile was your educational polygenic score rather than your actual academic degrees?" If that starts happening, which isn't too fanciful, the biological caste system Herrnstein and Murray warned of could become a reality. To paraphrase Irving Kristol's book about capitalism, I give meritocracy 2 cheers. It helps a little when it comes to securing people's consent to the outcome inequalities that are inevitable if you limit the powers of the state, but it doesn't do enough, judging from the populist revolts of 2016. And the cognitive elite hasn't yet become a hereditary elite, although it may in time. There are also the practical benefits to consider. All things being equal, a country's economy should grow faster, its public services should be run more efficiently, its politicians should make better decisions, diseases should be eradicated faster, and so on, if the people at the top possess the highest IQs and make the most effort. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Toby, for a fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. Lots of material there for discussion. So could I now invite Professor Eniko Bolobash to respond? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was tremendously fascinating. It's not an easy job to respond on the spot to such a presentation. Let me start with something that comes from our Hungarian background, which you didn't touch upon explicitly, but actually both of you, British speakers, kind of slided on. The Rise of Meritocracy. The article, the definite article, I certainly know that Mark skipped it, and Toby kind of was silent on it. And that is because meritocracy is such a noun that invites both the definite pronoun and the absence of the definite pronoun. In other words, it acts like aristocracy, where we use the definite pronoun, it's the aristocracy, but also like theocracy or gerontocracy or plutocracy or theocracy or probably I mentioned that already, or I had a few other bureaucracy, plutocracy, yeah, I think autocracy. So it refers both to the rule of a particular class of people and also to that class of people. For us, for me it's very interesting because one of the staple mistakes Hungarians make in English has to do with the pronoun. Anyway, I admire the author who invents such a word that combines the two classes, two word types, noun types, and allows this freedom. Okay, so basically the ultimate issue is equality or inequality. Can equality be just? Or is it always unjust? And I assume that in this very interesting and still timely dystopia, I wonder if it's a utopia, it's a dystopia rather, he presents such a nightmare of a good principle, the application of a good principle, a positive principle, but turning into such a nightmare that we could not have, or they could not have imagined before. The genre of the book. Well, it's supposedly sociology, Probably, yes. It's an ironic sociology, a fictional sociology, dystopic sociology. Certainly fiction, part of it is fiction. I admire those footnotes. I love those footnotes that he gives of texts published after 1958, that he makes up. But actually, looking back from 2019, these footnotes all pass, they go well, yes. This could have happened, such studies could have been published. It's a very British book, extremely British book, and very much grows very much out of its times, of the 50s, 40s, 50s, when the debate on comprehensive schools and on British education was at its height. At the same time, it certainly has a wider relevance, not only expanding the issues, the questions and the answers across the ocean to the US, because it speaks about these two systems of education, these two systems of society, but it seems to ring true very often for us Hungarians, even though we have been very far from, at that time we were extremely far from Britain in 1958. It's very British in its tone as well, sarcastic, ironic, full of double meanings, double entendres. He's serious and yet not serious at the same time. He means it, he doesn't mean it. I read a few passages from it. I think Toby didn't emphasize it, that this fictional literary nature of the book, but I come from literature studies, and for me it's a fine piece of fiction. A fine piece of fiction, certainly relying on a very important British tradition, going back to Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift and H.G. Wells and George Orwell. So it's this tongue-in-cheek mode of discussing with a lot of humor something of extreme significance. Never taking himself too seriously, and that's a very, very British trait too. Okay. So I think that at this time in the 50s, a person with leftist leanings, with a background in British socialist thinking and even communist thinking, it makes a lot of sense that he would discuss such topics as the society that is unequal in a just or unjust way. It's a very strange phrase, I understand. Unjustly or justly equal. But basically that's a concept that he throws in, not with these words. He's a better speaker than I am, or writer, obviously. Let me just take this comment or reference that Toby made to Markowitz's essay about the perpetuation of cognitive oligarchies. And what I thought of when I heard this phrase was how nobody has conducted a survey, a proper sociological survey, a proper philosophical, sociological survey in political science, with political science, whatever, on second and third generation communist privilegentia. I would love that. How many of them are sitting in the European Parliament, for example? Now that's second and third generation. You know, those who perpetuate this oligarchy, and those who were picked not for merit, but for political loyalty or servitude or forever. So we are talking about children and grandchildren of communist, the communist power elite. I would be tremendously interested in a study on them because, you know, in already one generation, this privilegentia background is lost, and they are simply part of the professional and intellectual classes of the meritocracy. So, of course, this is not a new problem, because second generations posed problems in every society that proclaimed their power elite. What comes to mind is the elect in the early American colonies. You know, these earliest Puritan colonies, which were theocracies in the 1620s, 30s, and so on. And theocracy in the sense that those were the social leaders of the group who also testified to belonging to the elect in terms of their religion. That is, they were invited, elected, chosen by God. And the way they testified was that they gave their conversion experience, narrated that conversion experience in church. And it was a basic thing in the early American colonies, and there are some wonderful accounts of these conversion experiences. And basically, you know, you were part of the covenant by grace, the grace of God, not works but grace. Anyway, the real problem arose when they had children. Now, what's going to happen to the children of the elect? And they came up with this wonderful idea of a halfway covenant for their children. So they got the promise of the elect, but not the elect yet. But they had a much easier path to become the elect. So that was, 400 years ago. So what you do, what the elite does with their children, and how they keep the power that they acquired, is everywhere a huge issue. Obviously, and this shows how very British a book this is, through education. Education is supposed to be the best path to be a member of the meritocracy, to become a member. But once you get your good education, you can pay for such a good education for your children too. I was surprised to find that comment in the book, which made the distinction between British and American education in terms of what they emphasize. That is, the British, or for British education, secondary education is more important, and that's where things get decided, whereas in American education, it's the college and university. and that in America, universities have a leveling function, whereas in Britain, grammar schools, public schools, which are actually it's the British private school, they have a distancing function. They have the function to select those who are the best, whereas the American university has a leveling function among the classes. Where the book turns into dystopia, into a nightmare, is where meritocracy really solidifies inequalities, where it discusses how meritocracy solidifies inequalities. Let me read a couple of passages to you. So, under the hereditary system, you could blame your lower status on the social inequalities active in society. And you could say that actually I'm better than them, I just don't have the opportunities. Here I am, a workman. Why am I a workman? Am I fit for nothing else? Of course not. Had I a proper chance, I would have shown the world. A doctor, a brewer, a minister, I could have done anything. I never had the chance, and so I am a worker. But don't think that at bottom I am any worse than anyone else. I'm better. Okay. Now this changes in meritocracy, in a meritocracy. Because then the lower classes will not have this excuse that they didn't have a chance because they have equal opportunities. Now, their image of themselves, while their image of themselves was flattering, here they are not bound to recognize that they have not because they were denied opportunity, but because they are inferior. So the lower classes, Michael Young claims, have now to recognize that it's not the lack of opportunities, but it's the fact that they are lower. They are more stupid, they have a lower IQ, they are inferior. It's like when Joseph Heller says that it's not paranoia when they are really after you. Okay, now just to give you another, equal opportunity meant equality of opportunity to be unequal. Okay. I think it's a very important thought, and the consequences of so depressing the status of the inferior and elevating that of the superior have naturally engaged the full attention of social science, he says, and then it will lead to this revolution. Sarcasm. I love the sarcasm. It's just so, just a second. Sarcasm is pink in my book. In an earlier age, the sumptuary laws passed by Henry VII to force lords to eat in the same hall as their retainers were not only for the benefit of the retainers. In modern times, there is nothing to be gained from social mixing, he says, in school, in residence, or at work, because the upper class now have little or nothing to learn from the lower. So this is when meritocracy is at full swing, when it has been perfected, materialized. So he claims that the principle of merit really breeds very unhappy people, because they have to now face the fact that they are part of the lower classes, the term he uses, because of their lack of merit. Or I think this is a terrific passage. Let me read this to you. This is one of the upper classes in a meritocracy speaking, and demanding the fact that he needs help, he needs service, he needs servants, domestic servants, because he's fit for higher work, higher goals. We are the thinkers, he said, are we not? We are paid to think. Well, what do we need to do? What do we need to do our work well? We need quiet. No man who is disturbed by noise can devote himself to single-minded concentration. We need comfort. No man who is forced to consider little physical irritations can scale the heights of achievement. We need ample holidays. History shows that scientists have often hit upon the missing link in a chain of thought quite unexpectedly when they were bathing in the sea, walking in the mountains, or drowsing by the Caribbean. A brilliant man can do a full year's work in 8 months, but not in 12. We need secretaries at work and domestic servants at home. The chores of life exact energy from the talented, which should be devoted to higher things. Just as a carpenter needs a chisel or a mechanic, a spanner, we must have books to enlighten, pictures to stimulate, wine to soothe. It is not for ourselves, we ask. It is for the good of society, to whose service our brains are dedicated. No jealousy, no vanity, no selfishness must stand in the way of human achievement and social progress. So, this is the elite in a meritocracy speaking. I deserve all this. So really this idea of deserving rich, undeserving rich or poor, that enters here too. Let me return to something Toby mentioned, the perpetuation of cognitive oligarchies. So, for us in this part of the world, socialist ideas and communist ideas have a very different ring, obviously. You know, they were used as means, as parts of this whole technology of oppression. And it's very hard for us to, for me certainly, I shouldn't speak in the plural probably, but to understand that in 1958, parts of a book still sided with the socialists, because there are chapters there. 1958 was 2 years after the 56 uprising, was, only years after our Gulag prisoners returned. So it's hard. I wasn't happy reading that part because, I understand that the British have an island mentality, but we were not that far away, probably. So I cannot accept those. I cannot accept.
Real socialism was happening here. Real socialism.
Yes, of course, but that's the problem of vocabulary. Yes, absolutely. But we can't always. You're talking about this wonderful poetic rhetorical trope, catachresis, when there's a word already used in one meaning, and then another word in this enters and asks to be let in this ménage à trois. And so socialism has this meaning in Eastern Europe and Western Europe, but we don't always specify. I think that was my Hungarian problem there, because 1958 was very different for us. You know, our young and old were just executed, and you know, thousands of our martyrs, and then tens of thousands left. I don't even want to go into that because that's okay. So you said very justly that meritocracy is probably not with these words, but another manifestation of the hereditary principle. It is becoming one, at least. And that really is what the dystopia is about, how these inequalities are being legitimized, and how our communist privilegentia has become a hereditary elite. You know, if you again apply or look a little east. Yes. Your presentation of these genome studies was just fascinating. I don't think I understand half of it, but I know it's a huge, huge thing. But are we then facing really a genotocracy? We are. It's really, I mean, but that's so disillusioning, you know, that then education really isn't that big a deal, nurture isn't that big a deal, it's all nature, not all, obviously. So the more meritocracy we have, the more chances we have that it's going to develop into a genotocracy. And of course, post-communist Estonia is more meritocratic, of course. I mean, that was no surprise for us. Again, I would love to see a study on Hungarian post-communism from this perspective. That would be so, so important. But, you know, we can tell you the conclusion in advance. I should close. Let me just, yes. Let me just see, I have, yes. Okay, I can close now. Thank you very much. I'm moving, sorry, yeah. I just wanted to check if I...
Well, thank you very much indeed, Professor Bolobash. I'll now invite Professor Peter Ákos-Bod to lead a discussion at the table amongst the three panelists. Unfortunately, we're under fairly tight time restrictions. We have to vacate this room at 5:30, as I understand it, Melissa. So, which doesn't give us terribly much time. But if by any chance the discussion winds up before 5:30, there'll be an opportunity for some questions from the audience. But we'll see how it goes. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. I would stay here at my table, and to save time, and it was a kind reminder that time is money, and then we'll have finished. But for the reason that we'll have another event here, which I will go into chair myself, because this is the economic club, Budapest Economic Club. We'll have a session here, and if you are interested in the health reforms and changes in the health system in Central Eastern Europe, please stay. Now, but the topic I'm just going to comment on, and also perhaps moderate you as the speakers, and also moderate the audience. This is the job for me. I have not prepared statements. I listened very carefully and tried to digest, since Toby Young's lecture was full of data, facts, terms, hypotheses about the changes of modern society is not easy to follow, not easy to understand. And yes, the book itself is not an easy read. Aniko says it's a British book. I think the humor and satire is certainly British, but the topic is universal. And I found that the book is very Hungarian in some sense, since the question, who chooses and selects the elite and how the elite reproduces itself is an age-old story, and the story of the present and transition, and the reference to Estonia, the former communist Estonia, of course, is an easier case because Estonia certainly became much more rational in this sense. Rationality is part of, I think, of the meritocracy. Hungary is a more complicated case. But first, let me just, not a critical remark, but a remark about the title of the book. It says The Rise of the Meritocracy. Now, actually, if you start reading it, it's the rise and fall of meritocracy and the rise of the populist movement. The populist movement appears in the second page of the book, at least in my copy, which I borrowed on short lease from Central European University, Budapest, Vienna. That's not a political statement, it's just a fact. Thank you very much, Mr. Soros. Okay, and then in the very last page, there's a reference to the death of the author who was himself killed at Peterloo. I don't know what Peterloo, what was the significance of Peterloo?
Citing a previous uprising.
Uprising. Okay, so that's why it's not the rise of meritocracy, the death of meritocracy and the rise of populism. And it's interesting because there are three things that you can talk about having sociologists, linguists, and selected people of great merit in here, is what meritocracy, the elite itself, and populism. And there's not much, the populism was not much discussed around the table. I just call upon the audience to comment. Since what we see here, and they all come from the science elite, the meritocracy elites ourselves, we have to admit that our influence in society is now less and less, and the influence is higher and higher and higher. So we live in a very strange transition society. So that was point one, the title of the book, and then whether it's why we have not discussed what came after that sort of rule. Now, Michael Young's skepticism, reservation about the demerits of the meritocracy is interesting in Hungary because what was before in Estonia, what was before in Hungary? Toby, you raised the question before we started the discussion, and certainly after the collapse of the capitalist regime after the Second World War, the Bolsheviks took over, and it's very hard to claim that that was a meritocracy. But in some sense, they became powerful, and of course they wanted to reproduce themselves in their own way, and the end of their rule, they became some sort of hereditary elite. Old farts, sorry, so old guys. You remember standing, dying one after another in the Khrushchev, and then the series of the old guys. So, so we look at more sympathy at the meritocracy than we should, having read the book, because the criticism is also very strong in it. Now, on Hungary and on the intellectuals, well, I just bumped into Ivan Selin the other day, and then he wrote a book, perhaps some of you remember, even before, with Conrad, before the collapse of the communist regime, late 80s, the intellectuals as the new ruling class. Okay, so, wrote the book, and the book was published later and started to circulate, and okay. So there is a research, he continued the research on the Hungarian elite, and then the story is un-British, of course, because we did have a hereditary elite long time ago that was killed, destroyed by the World Wars, and then the hereditary rich were destroyed by the regime changes, because we've been through at least 6 or 7 regime changes in the last 150 years, so it's not the British case. And then we had these self-made heroes, and then the school-made elite. And then now I don't know how to conclude. Well, I stop here. Fortunately, we have not enough time to discuss it, because I have views on it, but I just, to provoke a bit discussion, I just mentioned for your education that if you look at the Hungarian present political scenery, unique in political history, the most important three persons in Hungary, the Prime Minister, the numero uno, the President, and the Speaker of the House, come from the same law school, same dormitory, and they were somehow chosen by the last decade of the declining communist regime, which selected them for ELTE.
But they are also first generation.
Yeah, okay. So that's what I just want to, to point out, and then this, I think, is a good provocation to confront theories with facts, and also cultural conditions and national situations, and also the variety of the beauty of the topic, because then we have to provide some answer how elite is recruited, how elite reproduces itself, and whether we like it, and what will come after one sort of elite collapses, another elite emerges, rises, and falls. So that was my provocation to the speakers, and also to the...
At this point, Professor, we could offer Toby Young an opportunity to respond to some of your comments and those of Professor Bolobash.
Let's take questions.
So thank you very much. Thank you for the floor. I have a number of relatively short questions and points. First of all, a corrective. The book is not British, it's English. I went to university in Scotland, exactly at the time when the book was published. I remember talking about it. It felt very alien. We're talking sort of 59, 60. So I think we should be quite clear. It's an English tradition, not a British one. As far as the elect is concerned, you may know James Hogg's book, but if you don't, you'll enjoy it. True Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner, published about 1823. Toby, first of all, I mean, you spent time correctly, I think, on roles. You didn't mention Isaiah Berlin, who I think is equally important as part of the Anglo-Saxon tradition from which you come. And here what I particularly want to mention is Isaiah Berlin's insight that some values are incommensurable. He particularly points to justice and mercy, but a number of others. So the question of fairness is not self-evident, and if I could draw you on this. And the second point I want to draw you on is, I think from the way in which you presented it, you assume that merit was static. Now, I actually think that the definitions of merit change over time. I think it's dynamic. And what was regarded as meritorious, let's say, in Northcote Trevelyan time, is not necessarily the same in 58 or 2019. And I wonder if you'd care to speculate on this. Third point I wanted to make, yes, it's about hierarchy and status, and, if you like, unfairness. But don't forget, if you have an established hierarchy, that provides stability and predictability. And for a significant proportion of society, I'm sure you know Karen Stenner's work about authoritarianism, and she's a social psychologist, that actually the hierarchy is helpful. It's a positive experience because you know where you are. Your modes of communication are clear. And I think my last point is about Estonia. I was actually in Tallinn yesterday. I live much of my time in Tallinn. And I want to make a number of points about, I think that's right, the educational attainments are very impressive. You have highly motivated teachers who actually use the PISA scores to motivate children. And you can then take this back to Estonian nationhood, very strong, much stronger than here, as a matter of fact. It's a much smaller ethno-national community, about 900,000 people. And there's a strong sense of the former subaltern talking back to the Russians, the colonial overlord. We are doing a lot better than Russia in a number of respects. The whole Estonia phenomenon, which is fascinating. And the other point I want to make, Estonia really does differ. It's never had a native aristocracy. And I think this is a relevant point to us, Hungary, Britain, Scotland too, for that matter, that the aristocracy was partly Russian, partly German. Let me stop there. Question marks?
Yes, I just wonder if we're not sometimes confusing elite with meritocracy, because every country, as far as I know, has an upper class, somebody who runs things for the most part. They're there. And then meritocracy implies that somehow they studied to get there. They did something, specifically, something formally. And the Chinese had exams for mandarins going back to 2,500 years or more. That doesn't mean the upper class was the same, but it was a way to get up in the world. Royal Navy, examination for lieutenants, 17th century, late 17th century, and almost anybody could get into the Royal Navy and try to make it up to the exam. Military academies, 17th and 18th centuries, all these were exams. And all these organizations were ways to get ahead, and quite successfully, at least for a small number of people. Then what we have today, I'm not sure. We have elites. You don't have to take an exam to get in. And a lot of the members who are up there are not active. And this is what you said about the generations. So what happens in the second and third generation of the families who got in there? And the children are living normal lives, and maybe they have more money in a trust fund someplace. And there is a certain social network, but they're not governing the country. So power doesn't translate. It's not held, especially in Western countries. I'll just stop there.
Yeah, Brian Ebinger, Corvinus University of Budapest. I have a short question to Professor BPA, both Peter Ákos in Hungarian. My question is, what's your opinion on utilitarianism in the so-called region, eastern part of Central Europe today, 30 years after the political change? Thank you.
I'm not sure if I should wait for answers or if I should ask questions. I can ask a question? Okay. So my question is for Toby Young. You mentioned how high IQ and effort, which is meritocracy in your father's definition. At the very end of your statement, you said that, or it seemed to me like you were saying that there's a connection between, there should be a connection between people with high IQs and high effort and ruling class status, the ability to get into the position to cure diseases or to rule and establish justice. So I have I have a question about that connection and whether or not high IQ and effort, meritocracy, really defines whether someone will take those places. Because I have examples in my head of people with meritocrats in ruling positions in society that have not cured diseases or, established justice. Politicians that have used their wits to electioneer or to establish alliances that require shrewd intellect, but choosing not to, I guess, use their meritocratic status to better society. So should that connection, I guess I'm asking a probing question about whether or not that connection is permanent or, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think at this point, rather than accumulating more questions, we might invite the panel to respond.
To address your the last point first, I think it is one of the paradoxes of meritocracy that as societies become more meritocratic, the quality of the leaders in those societies seems to decline. You would expect it to get better. If the hereditary principle is fading and people are selected according to the amount of effort they're prepared to make and how intelligent they are, you would expect, the political class, for instance, to be much better, to be on an upward improvement curve. But the opposite seems to be the case, certainly in the UK. And the current, we're in a terrible pickle at the moment, as you may have noticed, and there are numerous causes, but one question I think that it has prompted is, do we have much worse leaders today, much worse political leaders than we've had in the past? And people will compare Boris Johnson, for instance, unfavourably to Winston Churchill. And I think the one possible answer to this paradox is that in an aristocratic society, or a society in which the hereditary principle still exercises a lot of influence, the people at the top feel plagued by guilt that they haven't done anything to deserve their extraordinary privilege. And so they feel, therefore, an obligation to prove themselves worthy of their advantages. Noblesse oblige. And they're also concerned that because it's so obviously, so transparently unfair that members of the Lucky Sperm Club should be the ruling class, that they're constantly doing what they can to make that more palatable. So they're behaving in a generous, restrained, modest way in order to make their rule more acceptable. So paradoxically, and this is something my father writes about in The Rise of the Meritocracy, in aristocratic societies, the ruling class, because they felt they'd done nothing to deserve their elevated status, actually were more honourable, more dutiful, made much greater effort to prove themselves worthy of their status than the meritocratic class does in contemporary meritocratic societies, because they think they deserve their elevated status, so they don't feel under any obligation to prove that they've already proved it by accumulating this string of academic credentials and by earning the vast sums of money they earn and by having private jets and homes all over the world. They don't need to do anything else, such as be nice to taxi drivers or their domestic servants in order to demonstrate their suitability for this elevated position. Anyway, so I think that there's something in that as to why the ruling class today, in some respects, is clearly inferior to the ruling class selected by the hereditary principle 150 years ago. Do you want to address the question posed to you?
Well, it's a nice question, and when we'll have the wine, I will go into detail how I feel about the last 30 years of the Hungarian transition. Just very quickly, because this is not the main topic of today, the regime change. To understand the regime change and the transition, you have to see that there are rule-based systems and power-based systems. And when the rule collapses, then the selection of elite is very different from the one where there is a rule. And then the reproduction of the merited people goes on, and then you have a well-functioning civil service. 3 decades ago, the regime collapsed, and then a new elite emerged. If you ask us, we think this was the victory of meritocracy. You know, I was a head of department before and became a cabinet minister after. And the old commies, you know, the very old commies already retired. Now, what makes Hungary a very special case, and that's a big, difference from the Czech story, the Soviet story, that the reform communists behaved pretty well in the last 15 years before the collapse of the system. So they could claim, the members of the previous elite, that they are a meritocracy, since all went to universities. Typically, they were educated people, and their output was not bad. Even the output was not bad, at least if you compare the Hungarian situation to life in Ceausescu's Romania or Honecker's East Germany. So that's why they claimed that they should have a room in the new society, and when we took over, some of them were extremely unhappy. The Socialist Party bosses felt hurt because they thought that future would belong to them. I sat next to the previous finance minister in the week after the regime changed. Physically, the regime has changed. Peter Megyesi, who just lost his crown, and I was the new man, you know. And he was totally run down and unhappy. And I said, Peter, no, chin up. You may one day come back to politics. Unfortunately, that happened. It's not a meritocracy, just collapse of, you know, the first lot that Mr. Anta referred to as the first government, kamikaze government. So it's whatever you merit, you will lose because the expectation was so high. Okay, so then what came after that was history. Salini seemed to be right until the early years of transition, and now we had to learn that it's not a rule-based society. When the rules change, it's a power-based system. The pushy people, not necessarily the more educated, but sharp. And since the book starts with the IQ plus sweat formula, IQ plus efforts, I would say that this is true for the classical politics, but modern politics, and Hungary is a modern country, and the rise of populism to me means that it's EQ and sweat. You have to understand the resentment of people. So not IQ, but emotional. Good politicians are not the brightest. They're not the best to solve the, manage the economy, manage the society. No, they don't have to be good. It's enough if they can listen to people. And that sort of elite, the intellectual elite, sometimes turns out to be deaf to the common people. And modern politicians have an eye for that, and they can echo the resentment of people. And I think, not knowing too much about the American situation, Mr. Trump echoes certain resentment. So Hungary is a special case, but how I feel about the very present, I will talk to you over red wine.
Yes. That was interesting, but to go back to Eniko's comments, I think the book does belong to a literary tradition, genre, which certainly is true of Ireland as well as England, so Shaw and Swift. But I'm trying to think of a Scottish dystopian satirist, but there must be some. Orwell wrote 1984 on the Isle of Jura. Oh, there you are. You asked an interesting question. You made an interesting point, I thought, about hierarchies, which is that human beings seem naturally quite well disposed to hierarchies, and we don't just adapt to the hierarchies we find in the societies we're born into, we actively participate in creating and maintaining those hierarchies. It seems to be satisfying a sort of primitive psychological need for order and system. So given that, do we really have to worry that our existing hierarchy is potentially under threat? Is it going to collapse? Is it going to be overthrown in a violent populist revolt in 15 years' time, as my father prophesied? One reason for being fearful, according to Daniel Markovits in this book he's just published called The Meritocracy Trap, is increasing levels of inequality, in particular income inequality in the United States, which he attributes to the rise of meritocracy. And he has a lot of data in there about the accumulation of wealth by the top 1% and the top 0.1% and the huge incomes they earn compared to the middle class, which is becoming detached and unmoored from the rest of society, hollowed out, alienated. But that doesn't seem to be a feature of all meritocratic societies. So curiously, the United Kingdom, I think, is perhaps not quite as meritocratic as the United States, but fairly far along. But income inequality, at any rate, in the United Kingdom hasn't really changed in the last 30 years. And one of the interesting characteristics of the populist revolts of 2016 is that the populist leaders who have been electorally successful have, for the most part, been right of centre rather than left of centre, and increasing taxation, income redistribution has not been one of their rallying cries, quite the opposite, if you look at Trump, for instance. So it doesn't seem to be, insofar as there is a populist revolt prompted by unhappiness about the meritocratic elite, it doesn't seem to have produced a corresponding desire to redistribute income. I think this concept of fairness, you talked about fairness having different dimensions, and you mentioned Isaiah Berlin. I think this is a really, it's interesting to try and understand both the positive way in which meritocracy does, I think, up to a point, secure people's consent. I think it perhaps doesn't do it in the way my father imagined it would, though curiously he also thought it would lead to its own destruction. But he didn't like meritocracy because he thought it would sustain the inequalities associated with capitalism, that it would coat them with this patina of fairness, and in that way make them more publicly palatable. But it does this in a sort of paradoxical way. It makes them more palatable by persuading people that the people at the top do in some sense deserve their wealth and position. But at the same time, because they have to think of themselves, therefore, as deserving their lowly status, it produces a kind of conflicted attitude towards the elite and towards themselves and their status and towards the meritocratic principle. It's sort of, on the one hand, they acknowledge that the allocation, the distribution is fair, but on the other hand, it's iniquitous and unjust at another level. And I think it's right that people kind of, it can simultaneously secure consent and produce alienation. And that's one of the curiosities of meritocracy. I mean, one of the things which really I'm constantly kind of mystified by and trying to kind of understand and always come out with different theories about is, you see, I mean, one of the reasons I think that the concentration of power in Britain and America and across the Anglosphere in this tiny elite threatens the stability and sustainability of those societies isn't because it's new, but because in the past there were countervailing sources of identity and meaning, different hierarchies which overlapped with the dominant hierarchy. I mean, literature, for instance. In a literary society, literature was a huge source of solace, of comfort. You know, if your life wasn't working out as you wanted it to, if a child died, if you yourself lost a job or got a terrible illness, you could seek some comfort and solace in poetry, in great literature, in art. And that's not really true anymore. Religion used to serve that purpose as a countervailing source of meaning and identity and hierarchy to the dominant political socioeconomic hierarchy, and religion doesn't play that role anymore. But the thing which bewilders me, I mean, okay, I can accept that meritocracy may not be sustainable. It may have produced this unstable disequilibrium, which is spiraling towards a crisis. Maybe not in 15 years' time, but before long. The thing which constantly baffles me is why are we seeing the resurgence of socialist alternatives to free market capitalism across the West in Western universities? I mean, it's extraordinary that the most intelligent people, oftentimes the children of the meritocratic elite themselves, welcome socialism as a potentially superior alternative to our present way of life, when there are so many examples, as you mentioned, so many examples of, I mean, how did my father, how did he imagine in 1958, as you say, 2 years after the brutal suppression of the Hungarian uprising, why didn't he just abandon this kind of ludicrous, transparently cruel and vindictive and hopelessly unworkable bullshit? Why didn't he just abandon it? You know, why hasn't the West learnt the lessons of these failed experiments resulting in, as I said in my talk, the death of over 100 million people? Why hasn't it? How can the illusion continue, particularly amongst the most intelligent, the most educated people in Western society? So that is a constant source of bafflement to me. But I think one of the nice things I imagine about living in a country like Hungary must be that you can always appeal to the recent memory, or relatively recent, now fading, of the horrors of socialism in order to correct the illusions of the youth. It probably doesn't work. No, it doesn't work, I'm sure. Yeah. Cognitive dissonance. Anyway.
On that very good point, I think we might have to wrap things up. And by the way, you've raised a subject which the Danube Institute is going to be looking at very closely at the beginning of November as we examine 30 years since the fall of communism in a 1.5-day meeting, which will be great fun. But look, thank you very much indeed, Toby Young and our two other panelists. It's been a terrific discussion, I think, from the 1958 book and I suppose the British-American focus of that to broadening things out to how it's all seen in Hungary and the rest of East and Central Europe. So can I invite everyone to thank our panelists for a fascinating day.